5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome to Highway of the Hidden, where the forgotten roads of history still breathe, and the night hides more than shadows. Here, the restless dead whisper in the dark, cryptids stalk the tree line, and conspiracies linger just out of sight. Every mile takes us deeper into the unknown, and every story carries a chill. So buckle up and join me as we take a ride down the highway.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Highway of the Hidden. I'm your host, Polarbear. I want you to picture something simple tonight. Nothing dramatic, no haunted houses, no deep woods expeditions, just a normal drive, the kind most of us have taken 1,000 times. Late evening, maybe even a little past midnight. The road is mostly empty, the radio's low, headlights pushing forward into darkness that never quite feels fully empty. You're not scared, not even thinking about anything paranormal or cryptid wise. You're just moving through space, going home, going to work, heading somewhere familiar. And then something changes. Not outside first, but inside. The air feels heavier. Sounds seem to pull back. The world narrows down to what's directly in front of you. You check your mirrors without knowing why. The tree line feels closer than it should. You get the strange, undeniable feeling that you've crossed into somewhere you weren't meant to notice. Most people brush that moment off. They call it nerves, fatigue, imagination. But here's the part that keeps showing up in every report that we've covered on this show. People describe the same moment before an encounter. Not similar, the same. Same silence, same pressure, same awareness that something is aware of them first. Tonight isn't about proving cryptids exist, because we already know that they do. No, it's about pattern. Across decades, across cultures, across people who have nothing to gain and often everything to lose by speaking up. Encounters follow rules, conditions, almost like invisible environmental triggers, if you will, that line up just the right moment, and suddenly two worlds overlap for a few seconds longer than they were supposed to. And when that happens, people see things, not always clearly, not always long enough to understand, but long enough to know they didn't imagine it. Big shapes pacing tree lines, figures standing where nothing should stand, eyes shine where no animal behavior makes sense. Movement that feels intelligent but refuses explanation. What we're going to talk about tonight is not just the creatures themselves. We're talking about why encounters happen at all. Because once you understand the conditions, the stories stop sounding random and they start sounding inevitable. There's an idea shared quietly among hunters, truck drivers, park rangers, oilfield workers, etc. The people who spend real time outside city limits, okay? And the kind of people who usually don't chase attention. They'll tell you the woods aren't empty. Not haunted in a way movies show, not magical, just occupied in ways modern life trained us to stop noticing. Human beings used to understand transitional spaces, places between safety and uncertainty, edges of forest, river crossing, old trails, area where visibility changes and sound travels differently. Our ancestors respected those places because survival depended on it. Now, we drive through them at 70 miles an hour with Bluetooth and music jamming and headlights cutting through night, making it look like day. And still, sometimes something out there notices us before we notice it. Tonight, we start with the question asked first. Not what did people see, but what had to be true for them to see anything at all? Because encounters don't begin with creatures. No, they begin with conditions. And once those conditions line up, well, ladies and gentlemen, the highway changes. Most people imagine a cryptid encounter as a random event, wrong place, wrong time, a freak accident of circumstance. But when you line up thousands of reports, not internet stories, but interviews, ranger logs, local reports, whispered conversations at gas stations and hunting camps, encounters cluster, not just geographically, but environmentally and psychologically. There are places where sightings almost never happen, and places where they repeat over and over across generations. Even when the populations change and decades pass between witnesses, the first condition is isolation, but not total isolation, and that's important here. Deep wilderness rarely produce encounters. Counterintuitive, but it's true. The deepest backcountry tends to remain quiet. People go in expecting danger, senses heightened, awareness sharp. Humans behave like visitors there. Encounters happen instead in edges, the places where civilization fades but doesn't fully disappear. We're talking logging road, rural highways, power line clearings, river banks behind neighborhoods, oil access roads cutting through East Texas pine, areas where human presence exists, but it's inconsistently exists. These are transition zones, and transition zones create uncertainty. Animals behave differently there. Sound carries unevenly, light breaks unpredictably through trees and terrains. Human brains evolved to detect threat, begin scanning harder without conscious permission. That heightened scanning state matters more than people realize because the second condition isn't location, it's awareness shift. Witnesses almost always describe a moment before the encounter where normal thought stops. Conversations trail off, music gets turned down. A sudden urge to look around appears without explanation. Psychologists might call it hypervigilance. Hunters call it instinct. Older traditions called it something else entirely. They called it being watched. The body recognizes environmental anomalies faster than the conscious mind can explain them. Changes in sound frequency, absence of insects, wind stopping abruptly, even subtle scent shifts. The forest doesn't go silent dramatically like in movies, it fades unevenly. One layer of sound drops out, then another, and humans notice even if they don't know why. This is where many encounters actually begin, not when the creature appears, but when attention locks into place. The third condition is timing. Late evening into early morning dominates encounter reports, but not simply because it's dark. Darkness alone doesn't explain it. The critical window tends to occur during transition periods, dusk, deep night, between activity cycles and pre-dawn, times when patterns overlap. In nature, overlap equals vulnerability. Predators move, prey relocates, territories shift temporarily. Movement increases while visibility decreases. Humans enter that rhythm unknowingly, becoming part of it. Truck drivers feel it on long hauls. Hunters sitting in stands feel it right before sunrise. Night shift workers driving empty roads feel it strongest. That sense the world is operating on rules slightly different than any daytime life. And then comes a condition almost nobody talks about openly. A shocking number of witnesses encounter something near places they traveled many times before, roads they know, trails they trust, backyards even. Familiar environments lower defensive awareness. The brain runs on autopilot. That relaxed state creates contrast when something abnormal appears, making the moment burn deeper into memory. It's why people remember encounters in exact detail years later. The brain flags it as survival instantly, okay? Then there's the final condition, the one that ties everything together, the stillness. Not silence, the stillness. Witnesses often describe the feeling as if the environment itself is watching you. This is what many researchers and people who have experienced this quietly refer to as the beginning of the Oz effect. That's right, the Oz effect. A moment where normal sensory processing shifts, distance feels distorted, and time seems slightly delayed. People don't step into another world. It feels more like the world steps sideways around them. And right there, in that narrow overlap between expectation and reality, the encounters begin. Not with attacks, not with chaos, but with observation. And why that is because the overwhelming majority of first encounters share one truth. Before humans ever see anything, something has already been watching them for a long time. And most witnesses only realize that afterwards, when they replay the moment again and again, trying to figure out when the feeling started. Usually, it started miles before they ever noticed. Now, there's a reason most encounters don't begin with fear here. That surprises people when they start comparing stories. You would expect terror to come first, panic, shock, immediate danger, but instead, witnesses often describe something quieter, confusion, curiosity, a strange pull to keep looking when instinct says to leave. Because the first stage of an encounter is rarely confrontation. it's observation. And more often than not, humans are not the observer. Once the conditions we talk about settle into place, isolation without emptiness, awareness sharpening, the environment slipping into stillness, something else enters the equation. Not suddenly, not just a subtle realization that movement exists where movement shouldn't. A shape between trees doesn't match the pattern of branches, a shadow that remains after the headlights pass, footsteps that stop the exact moment a person turns their head. The earliest Bigfoot type encounters, especially across the Pacific Northwest and deep sections of East Texas, follow this pattern almost perfectly. Hunters describe sensing company long before visual confirmation. Not hearing pursuit, not seeing aggression, just the unmistakable feeling of being paced. One man driving a logging road outside Mount St. Helens described it simply. He felt like he was being escorted. His truck crawled along gravel at maybe 15 miles an hour, windows down, engine echoing off dense timber. Every few seconds, he heard movement paralleling him just inside the tree line, heavy steps matching speed, never rushing, never falling behind. At first, he assumed elk, maybe a bear moving away from the road. But elk break rhythm, bears crash through brush. This movement stayed controlled, deliberate, almost careful. When he slowed, it slowed. When he sped slightly, it adjusted. He never saw it fully, but he did get a glimpse of it just once in a gap between trees, a vertical shape taller than the hood of his truck, moving upright for 2 steps before disappearing back into shadow. No charge, no sound afterward, just absence. And the strongest memory he reported later wasn't fear, it was certainty. The certainty that whatever it was had known he was there long before he noticed anything at all. That detail repeats constantly. So these encounters feel less like accidents and more like awareness tests. Moments where something elevates distance, behavior, and intent. Another report from East Texas, not far from the oil access roads cutting through pine and swamp, finishing a late shift. They stopped near a clearing to check equipment just after midnight. Floodlights from their truck illuminated the immediate area, but behind that circle, the woods stayed completely black. One of them notices a rock landing softly nearby, not thrown hard, just dropped into brush. At first, they joked about kids messing with them, but the nearest house sat miles away. The rocks continued, spaced out, almost rhythmic, okay? Then came a knock, not metallical, not mechanical, wood on wood. 3 slow strikes from deeper in the tree line. Anyone familiar with forest reports recognizes that detail immediately. Wood knocks appear across decades of Bigfoot encounters worldwide. Different witnesses, same sound pattern. The men left quickly, no investigation, no heroics. And again, what stayed with them wasn't danger, it was communication. Not language, not friendliness, just acknowledgement. You are here, I am here. That is enough. These watcher stage encounters almost always end without escalation. The presence withdraws once recognition happens. Witnesses return home shaken but unharmed, often questioning themselves for years before realizing others experience nearly identical events. Which raises a question that doesn't get asked enough. If these beings intended harm, why reveal themselves at all? Predators rely on surprise, silence, and efficiency, but watchers behave differently. They allow partial detection, a glimpse, a sound, movement, just clear enough to register but never fully confirm. It's controlled exposure. And that behavior right there appears across cultures long before modern cryptid terminology existed. Indigenous stories throughout North America described forest people who observed travelers, especially those moving respectfully through land. European folklore speaks of wild men or guardians of wooded boundaries who watch roads and crossings but rarely interfere unless provoked. We're talking different names but same behavior, watching without engaging. Even modern hikers describe moments where the woods feel occupied without visible cause. Cameras malfunction, batteries drained unexpectedly, animals disappear from an area seconds before a feeling of presence arrives. And then nothing happens, which frustrates skeptics because nothing dramatic means nothing provable. Patterns don't need drama to exist. They need repetition. Another witness, a bow hunter sitting quietly before dawn in Michigan, describes hearing footsteps circle behind his blind for nearly 20 minutes. Too heavy for deer, too steady for coyotes. Each time he shifted slightly, the steps stopped instantly. He finally gathered the nerve to stand. Silence. No retreating sound. No crashing through brush. Just the overwhelming sensation that whatever had been there, decided the interaction was finished. Later inspection revealed impressions in soft ground spaced wider than human stride, deeper than expected for a person walking normally. No clear tracks, just pressure marks leading towards thicker forest. Again, no aggression, just proximity. The watcher phase reveals something important about cryptid encounters that rarely gets discussed openly. Most of these experiences are not about hunting humans, they're about assessment. Distance is maintained carefully, encounters end once awareness becomes mutual. Witnesses often report feeling released afterward, tension draining suddenly as if an unseen boundary reopened. And that emotional shift matters. Fear arrives when the human mind catches up and realizes what should have happened, but it didn't. Something there was large enough to overpower them and chose not to. And that realization unsettles people more than any attack would because it suggests intention. By the end of the watcher stage, one truth becomes difficult to ignore. Humans are not always the center of the encounter. Sometimes we are simply passing through territories where awareness already exists, awareness that notices, evaluates, and then decides whether we are worth further attention or not. Most encounters end right there. A story told quietly, a memory replayed late at night, another unexplained moment added to a growing collection of similar accounts scattered across highways, forests, and forgotten roads. But occasionally, something breaks the pattern. Distance closes, observation turns into approach. And when that boundary shifts, when the watcher decides not just to observe, but to enter human space, the encounter changes completely. Because not everything that notices us is content on being hidden. There are moments in certain encounters where the rules change, okay? Witnesses don't always recognize it immediately. At first, everything feels like the watcher phase. Distant movement, sounds just outside visibility, the steady awareness of being noticed. But then something subtle shifts. The space between human and presence begins to close. Distance, which had felt carefully maintained, disappears. And that is when fear finally arrives. Because the watcher is no longer watching, it's approaching. Across encounter reports, this transition almost always feels wrong on an instinctual level. Before anything is clearly seen, people describe their stomach dropping, adrenaline surging without cause, an overwhelming urge to leave immediately. Not curiosity anymore, but survival instinct activating all at once. The environment, that changes too. Sound doesn't just fade, it feels suppressed. Footsteps become harder to track directionally. The air itself feels heavier, almost charged, as if the moment has narrowed down to a single point of focus. This is where encounters move into what many researchers quietly call boundary events, moments before something crosses from observation into interaction. Dogman type encounters appear here more often than any other category. So, unlike watcher behaviors associated with the forest giant types, these encounters involve deliberate visibility. Witnesses don't just sense something nearby, they see movement designed to be seen. A man driving through rural Kentucky on a two-lane road just after midnight described cresting a hill and seeing what he first believed was a large deer standing upright at the edge of his headlights. That confusion lasted only seconds, long enough for the brain to attempt a normal explanation. The shape turned, not startled, not fleeing, turning intentionally toward the vehicle. He described that long arms hung forward, shoulders higher than any human proportion would allow, the head carried forward from the body instead of sitting upright, ears visible against the light before the figure stepped fully onto the road. The driver slowed without meaning to. Many witnesses do. The brain stalls between disbelief and recognition. The figure crossed halfway, then stopped, not frozen, but watching. Eyeshine reflected back, not scattered like deer eyes, not low like a predator crouching, but level, with the driver's own gaze. For several seconds, neither moved. Then, with controlled motion, it stepped backward into darkness and disappeared. Not sprint, not panic, just withdrawal once attention was secured. The man drove home shaking, later realizing the most disturbing detail wasn't what he saw, it was how intentional the movement felt. The figure had entered the road only when the vehicle reached a precise distance, close enough to confirm visibility, far enough to remain safe. That calculated behavior repeats constantly in these close range encounters. Another report from Wisconsin involved a group of teenagers parked near a farmland at night, the kind of rural gathering spot common across America. They began hearing footsteps circling the vehicle, heavy enough to vibrate through the ground, assuming someone was trying to scare them. One person flashed a phone light toward the trees. Two reflective eyes appeared immediately, far higher than expected. Then the shape stood up. Witnesses, they later disagreed on the details. Height estimates varied, proportions blurred by fear, but every account agreed on one thing: the movement from crouch to upright felt impossibly smooth, too fluid for something that large. The figure advanced 3 steps, not rushing, but testing. The group fled instantly, engines roaring, gravel spraying behind them. None reported pursuit, but several described seeing the silhouette pacing alongside the tree line as they drove away, matching speed briefly before fading into darkness. This is where encounters stop resembling wildlife entirely. Animals bluff charge or retreat. They react emotionally, fear, aggression, or territorial defense. Boundary breakers behave strategically. They control visibility, distance, and timing with unsettling precision. And witnesses, they actually feel it. And many describe a psychological pressure accompanying the approach, not telepathical, not anything mystical they can explain, just an overwhelming awareness directed at them as if attention itself has weight. Hunters sometimes describe it as being locked onto. You're locked onto a target type thing, right? Your movement feels predictable, your options feel limited, the environment no longer belongs to you. One East Texas account involved a man checking hog traps before sunrise. He noticed the birds erupt from trees ahead of him, not flying away randomly, but clearing space along a narrow path through brush. Seconds later, something moved across that opening on 2 legs, fast enough to blur but slow enough to register form. Gray skin, thin limbs, head turning toward him mid-stride. The figure stopped behind a tree only yards away. No sound followed. Minutes passed, neither moving. The man later said the fear didn't come from appearance, but from realization. It knew exactly where he was without needing to search. Eventually, he backed away slowly, never turning his back. When he reached his truck and drove off, that feeling lifted instantly, like stepping out of deep water. These encounters rarely end with physical harm, which raises uncomfortable questions. If aggression isn't the goal, then what is? Boundary breakers appear to test reaction. They close the distance until fear becomes undeniable, then stop just short of escalation. Witnesses often describe the same emotional sequence: confusion, dread, certainty of danger, and then sudden release once the separation occurs. It resembles a dominance display more than predation, a reminder of hierarchy. Who's in charge here? Which, if you go into the woods, you are no longer in charge. You are aware of me now. Leave. And humans almost always do. There are, however, rare moments where encounters escalate further, as in bluff charges stopping feet away, objects thrown with force instead of gentle signaling, vocalizations described as layered between animal and human sound. Those moments linger longest in memory because they break the final illusion of safety. The witness realizes they are not simply sharing space with wildlife, but encountering intelligence operating under unknown rules. And once someone experiences that level of proximity, the world doesn't fully return to normal afterward. And that is where, like, night drives feel different, tree lines feel occupied, silence carries meaning. Every time you turn around, you're seeing that creature again and again and again. And you may not be seeing it, but your mind thinks that you are. Okay. And that's why the boundary, once crossed, never feels completely restored. What separates watchers' encounters from boundary encounters isn't just the distance, it's the intention. Okay. Watchers allow humans to exist nearby. Boundary breakers make sure humans understand, like I said, that they are not in control. And that understanding changes people. Some stop entering the woods entirely. Others return obsessively, trying to reconcile fear with fascination. Many stay quiet for years, unsure how to explain something that sounded impossible even to themselves. But across all these accounts, one detail repeats quietly beneath the fear. The encounter ends when the human chooses to leave, almost as if departure was the objective. all along, which leads to the question waiting underneath every close encounter: what happens when a person doesn't leave fast enough? Because the next stage of encounters isn't about observation or testing anymore. It's about the moment humans make the wrong decision inside a space that was never fully theirs to begin with. There's a point in nearly every serious encounter where the outcome stops depending on the creature and starts depending on the human. Most witnesses don't recognize that moment while it's happening. Later, sometimes years later, in this part, they replay endlessly the decision, the movement, the instinct they followed or ignored. Because encounters rarely escalate randomly. They escalate when communication breaks down. I'm not talking about spoken communication, something older than that, behavioral language, body language type thing. Signals shared across predators, prey, and territorial animals long before humans built cities and forgot how to read them. The mistake people make is assuming the fear is the problem. Fear isn't the problem, fear is expected. The problem is how humans respond to fear. When adrenaline hits, the body chooses one of the three reactions automatically: freeze, flee, or confront, the good old fashioned fight or flight method. Modern life teaches us to override instinct, to investigate strange noises, to shine lights into darkness, to record instead of retreat. But in encounter environments, those learned behaviors collide with something operating on different rules, and that collision creates danger. A hunter in northern Arkansas described realizing too late that he had crossed into this moment. He had already experienced the watcher phase, footsteps pacing him through timber, and then the boundary phase when something large circled closer than comfort allowed. Instead of leaving, curiosity took over. He called out, a simple human instinct. Announce presence, identify the unknown, something as harmless as, hey, who's out there? But the woods answered almost immediately, okay? Not with movement toward him, but with a deep vocalization that he felt in his chest more than heard with his ears. Not a roar, not an animal call he recognized, something layered, almost like two sounds overlapping slightly out of sync. His body reacted before thought could catch up. Legs weakened, breath shortened. Every instinct screamed retreat. But he hesitated. That hesitation is the moment people get wrong, because hesitation reads differently depending on who or what is interpreting it. In human terms, hesitation means uncertainty. In territorial language, hesitation can mean challenge. The hunter later realized the sound had not been aggressive at first. It was a response, like a warning, acknowledging proximity. But by holding position, he unintentionally prolonged the interaction. Branches snapped closer, not rushing, but advancing. Only when he began backing away slowly did the sound stop. Each step backward reduced pressure almost instantly, as if invisible distance rules were reestablishing themselves. He reached his vehicle, shaken but unharmed, carrying one overwhelming realization: leaving earlier would have ended the encounter sooner. Another common mistake appears during roadside encounters is eye contact. Humans seek confirmation through the eyes. We look directly at what scares us because our brains demand understanding. But prolonged eye contact functions differently across species. Among predators, direct staring can signal dominance or confirmation. Multiple witnesses describe moments where encounters intensified the longer they stared. One woman driving through rural Ohio reported seeing a tall figure standing near a fence line, illuminated briefly by headlights. She slowed instinctively, trying to understand what she was seeing. Reflective eyes locking onto hers through the windshield. She didn't accelerate. No, she stared. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Then the figure stepped forward, not aggressively, but decisively, closing distance by several feet. Panic finally broke the paralysis, and she sped away. Heart racing, realizing afterward that movement only began once sustained eye contact occurred. Whether coincidence or communication, the pattern repeats enough to matter. Attention invites escalation. The third mistake, and perhaps the most dangerous, listen, the most dangerous is running blindly. Movies teach us to flee instantly, and that's wrong. Crashing through woods in panic, but forests are environments of uneven footing, limited visibility, and unknown terrain. Witnesses who ran without awareness often reported hearing pursuit sounds increase briefly behind them, Not necessarily a chase, but movement matching their panic. Rapid retreat signals prey behavior. Okay. Several experienced outdoorsmen describe surviving encounters specifically because they resisted the urge to sprint. Instead, they backed away deliberately, maintaining awareness without aggressive posture. Predatory psychology, whether animal or something stranger, responds strongly to sudden vulnerability signals. Calm withdrawal communicates disengagement. Panic communicates opportunity. And then there's the mistake modern technology introduced: recording. Phones come out almost automatically now. People want proof, validation, evidence strong enough to convince themselves later and also convince other people that they're not crazy. But witnesses repeatedly report devices malfunctioning during peak encounter moments: screens freezing, cameras refusing to focus, batteries draining unexpectedly. And whether this be due to environmental interferences, stress response, or coincidence doesn't matter as much as what happens psychologically. Attention shifts away from surroundings, the humans stop reading the environment, and that loss of awareness often coincides with escalations. Sound moving closer, pressure increasing, the feeling of being surrounded instead of observed. The encounter becomes unstable at this point. One park maintenance worker described attempting to film strange movement near a tree line at dusk. While focused on his phone screen, he failed to notice silence falling around him. When he finally looked up, he realized something large had moved significantly closer without sound. The shock nearly caused him to fall backwards. He left immediately afterwards and later admitted the encounter felt different the moment he stopped paying attention to the world around him and focused on capturing it instead. The woods demand presence, distraction, breaks unspoken rules. Across cultures, older traditions carry similar warnings long before smartphones existed. Do not stare too long, do not pursue, do not mock, do not linger after acknowledgement. These weren't superstitions alone, these were behavioral guidelines passed down through experience. This is where encounters either dissolve or intensify. And what's unsettling is how often witnesses realize afterwards that the presence seemed to mirror their own behavior. Calm produced distance, panic produced pressure, withdrawal ended interaction. Almost like a negotiation happening without words, which suggests something deeply uncomfortable. The encounter may not be random at all. It may just be responsive. Not every presence reacts the same way, but enough accounts align to reveal a pattern. Once awareness becomes mutual, humans are no longer passive participants. They are communicating whether they intended to or not. Every movement says something. Every pause sends a signal, and the environment responds accordingly. Most encounters end safely because instinct eventually wins. People leave, distance returns, sound comes back. Reality settles into familiar shapes again, but witnesses carry one lingering thought afterwards: a quiet certainty they can't shake. The moment they felt most afraid, the outcome has not yet been decided. It was still changing based on what they choose to do next. And that realization leads to a deeper question, one that stretches beyond individual encounters into something larger happening across the world right now. Because if these interactions depend on conditions and human behavior, then the rising number of encounters might not be a coincidence at all. It might mean the conditions themselves are changing. For most of human history, encounters like the ones we talked about tonight lived on the edges of communities. Stories passed quietly between hunters, travelers, and families who lived close to land most people never entered. They weren't widespread conversations, they didn't need to be. The boundaries held. Human spaces stayed human, wild spaces stayed wild. And between them exists a distance: physical distance, cultural distance, psychological distance. But something has changed over the last few decades. Not suddenly, not dramatically enough to make headlines, just slowly, steadily, almost invisible. The boundaries are moving, people. You can see it without ever mentioning cryptids. Roads cut deeper into forest every year. Housing developments appear where dense woods stood a generation ago. Oil access paths, power line corridors, hiking trails, cell towers. Thin lines of human activity threading through environments that once remained uninterrupted for centuries. We didn't remove the wilderness, we refragmented it. And fragmentation helps create overlap. Animals adapt to edges quickly because survival demands flexibility. Coyotes learn suburbs, deer walk neighborhoods, Predators shift hunting routes along human made clearings because movement becomes easier there. If unknown intelligence exists within these same environments, whether biological, undiscovered, or something we don't yet understand, they would experience the same pressure. Their territories shrink, their movement patterns intersect with ours more often, and encounters increase not because anything new appeared, but because separation disappeared. Many longtime outdoorsmen say the woods feel different now, even in places that look unchanged. More access points, more noise carried further than before, light pollution reaching deeper into rural areas. Night no longer feels fully dark. Human presence has extended into hours in locations that once belonged entirely to nocturnal cycles. 24-hour society means someone is always moving somewhere. Truckers, shift workers, travelers, explorers, chasing quiet spaces that no longer remain completely quiet. We entered the overlap zone permanently, and overlap creates awareness on both sides. There's another factor rarely discussed openly, and that's attention. For most of modern history, people learned to dismiss strange experiences immediately. Social pressure encouraged silence. Encounters stayed private because speaking about them risked ridicule or isolation. Now, communication moves instantly. A sighting in Michigan reaches Texas overnight. A story told anonymously online reveals patterns someone else recognizes across the country. People who once believed they were alone in an experience discover thousands describing nearly identical moments. Validation changes perception. When people stop dismissing instinct outright, they begin noticing environments differently. Subtle details register again, silent shifts, movement patterns, that feeling of entering a space that feels occupied. It doesn't necessarily mean encounters themselves are new. It may mean awareness is returning. Technology complicates this further. Cameras exist everywhere now, yet clear evidence remains strangely rare. That contradiction frustrates skeptics and believers equally, but witnesses often describe encounters happening in moments where technology fails to capture what the human mind experienced clearly. Grainy footage, partial shapes, sudden obstruction. I mean, we've all seen Bigfoot videos that look like they were taken on a potato. It's almost as if the encounters occur at the edge of perception itself, visible enough to witness, unstable enough to resist documentation, right? And maybe that tells us something important here. Encounters were never meant to be spectacles. They are brief overlaps between systems not designed to coexist continuously. And older cultures carried stories warning against pushing too far into certain places, not out of superstition alone, but respect for balance. Sacred groves, forbidden valleys, places travelers cross quickly without lingering. Modern culture removed these invisible boundaries. We mapped everything, named everything, lit everything, but naming a place doesn't mean understanding it, okay? And now people find themselves rediscovering something ancient through completely modern experiences, the realization that human dominance over environment may be less absolute than we assumed. And with these cryptid encounters increasing where expansion meets memory, landscapes that held patterns long before roads arrived, forest corridors that still function like migration routes, river systems older than cities, mountain passes used by travelers for thousands of years, places where movement has always happened. We are simply the newest travelers passing through. Some witnesses describe feeling less like victims of encounters and more like interruptions, temporary intrusion noticed by something accustomed to operating unseen. That perspective changes the emotional weight of these stories. Instead of asking why something appeared to us, that question emerges differently now. Why were we there at the exact moment? Why that road, that hour, that silence? Because encounters rarely feel random to the people who experience them. They feel timed, positioned, almost inevitable once conditions align. And as human expansion continues, those conditions appear more frequently. More roads at night, more isolated workers, more people seeking quiet places to escape crowded lives. More moments where awareness sharpens just enough for two worlds to notice each other simultaneously. The increase in encounters may not signal invasion or emergence, it may signal proximity. We are closer now, geographically and psychologically, to environments we once respected from a distance, and proximity changes relationships. The unsettling truth beneath modern encounter reports is not that something new is arriving, It's that something may have always been here, adapting quietly while humanity changed around it, watching roads replace trails, watching forests thin and regrow, watching lights spread across landscapes that once belonged entirely to darkness. And now, as humans wander deeper, searching for solitude we accidentally erased, we step again into spaces where awareness already exists, not hostile, not welcoming, but simply present, which leaves us with the realization that feels both ancient and new at the same time. Encounters are increasing because the line between worlds is no longer far away. It runs beside highways, behind neighborhoods, along tree lines we pass every day without noticing. And sometimes, late at night, when conditions align just right, that line notices us back. And here's the strangest thing that happens after an encounter. Life keeps going, people. The sun comes up, coffee tastes the same, work schedules don't change, bills still need paying, conversations continue like nothing ever happened. From the outside, everything looks normal, but inside, something shifts inside you permanently. Out there who have experienced these moments rarely become louder afterwards. They don't usually chase attention or try to convince the world of what they saw. Most do the opposite. They grow quieter, more observant, more aware of the spaces between the noise, right? Because once you've felt that kind of awareness directed at you, once you've stood in place where the world didn't feel empty anymore, the illusion of total control never fully comes back. You start noticing things, how different the air feels at the edge of the forest compared to an open field, how certain roads feel heavier at night than they do during the day, how silence isn't just the absence of sound, but sometimes the presence of something waiting. And maybe that's the real reason these stories matter. Not as proof, not as entertainment, but as reminders. Human beings didn't evolve under streetlights and concrete. For most of our existence, we lived alongside environments we respected because we understood we were only one part of something much larger. Awareness kept us alive. Humility kept us safe. Somewhere along the way, we convinced ourselves the unknown disappeared, mapped, explained, categorized out of existence. But the stories never stopped. They waited in rural towns and late night drives and quiet conversations shared only with people trusted enough to listen without laughing. Not because fear is spreading, but because recognition is. Tonight, it wasn't about monsters in the woods. It was about boundaries, the invisible lines between familiarity and mystery, between human certainty and the parts of the world that still operate beyond our understanding. Most of the time, those boundaries hold perfectly. We live our lives without ever noticing how close they run beside us. But every once in a while, the conditions align, a road grows quiet, the air changes, awareness sharpens, and for a brief moment, paths cross. Not long enough to explain, not long enough to prove, just long enough to remind us that the world may still be deeper, older, and more alive than we allow ourselves to believe. If there's one thing repeated across thousands of encounters, it's this. The experience ends when the person leaves. The road continues, the woods close behind them, and whatever was there returns to silence. Which means most of us will go our entire lives without ever seeing anything unusual. But it also means that when someone tells you their story quietly, carefully, unsure whether they should even say it out loud, maybe the right response isn't disbelief, maybe it's just listening. Because the highway doesn't just run through cities and towns, it runs through forgotten places, through edges and crossings, through the thin spaces where certainty fades, just enough for mystery to breathe. And whether we notice it or not, the road still exists, sometimes beside us, sometimes behind us, and sometimes just beyond the reach of our headlights. And you know what? Before we close out here, I'm going to give you my encounter. I was 10 years old, and I've told this story on other podcasts, and for the new listeners, I'm going to lay it out for you. I was 10 years old deer hunting with my dad in East Texas, and this is what started the whole journey for me. My dad asked me to get him a beer. I turned around to grab one, and when I did, I looked up, and in the right-of-way, this tree came to the ground, just the branch bending, and this monkey type thing let go of the tree. The branch shot up, almost kind of like a slingshot effect. The creature stood fully upright. It was huge, and it sprinted full speed across the right-of-way. The right-of-way was maybe 30, 45 yards wide. It ran it in less than 10 seconds, and it was gone. And it changed my life forever. And I thought I was alone during this encounter for a long time until I saw Unsolved Mysteries, and they were talking about the skunk ape. And then I realized this thing is actually called a Bigfoot. And that's what started this whole Highway of the Hidden thing, something I've dreamed about my whole life, starting a podcast where people can come on and tell their experiences, and I will listen to them. But with that being said, thank you for traveling with me tonight. This has been Highway of the Hidden. I'm your host, Polar Bear. And if you want to be on the show, shoot me an email. My email address is polarbearhoth@gmail.com. You can reach out to me on TikTok and Instagram, polarbearhoth, or Facebook, Highway of the Hidden. Until next time, people, keep your lights bright and be on the lookout of the road. You may just have an encounter.
And as the road disappears into the mist, the hidden waits for those brave enough to follow. Until next time, keep your eyes on the shadows and remember, every highway has its secrets. This has been Highway of the Hidden.